Welcome, everyone. Please note that this session is being recorded. We are pleased to offer French simultaneous interpretation for this session. If you wish to hear the voice of the interpreter, please select French from the interpretation menu at the bottom of your screen. If at any point you need support at any time during this webinar, you can reach out to our tech support using the chat feature. English participants may choose to view the auto-generated live transcripts or subtitles throughout today's session by clicking the closed caption live transcript button from the Zoom menu at the bottom of your screen. French subtitles cannot be viewed live, but we are pleased to make both English and French captions available on the session's recording. I'm Colleen Ferris, the Director of Innovations and Strategic Development at Healthcare Excellence Canada, and I'm pleased to be your host today. Healthcare Excellence Canada is a new organization launched in 2021 with a relentless focus on improving healthcare with and for everyone in Canada. I would like to start by acknowledging that we are meeting on land that has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples since the beginning. In particular, I acknowledge that I am hosting this webinar from Ottawa, Ontario, the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Our Spotlight series is an opportunity to have focused, constructive discussions and explore solutions to make improvements last as we work together to shape the future of quality and safety in healthcare across the country. Today's episode is titled What We've Learned So Far: Preparing and Responding to Natural Disasters. Climate change is a growing threat with wide-ranging impacts on our health. We have seen a record-breaking number of wildfires this past year across many provinces and territories. With increasing number of natural disasters across Canada and globally, we need to improve how we are prepared and respond to these emergencies to ensure safer, high quality of care. We invite you to share your questions and comments during today's webinar using our chat box in either English or French. We'll do our best to get to them all, and we encourage all of you to share your questions as we go along. As we jump into the webinar, we want to ensure that we are setting up an environment that is psychologically safe and recognize that these topics may be difficult for some. We'll add some mental health resources in the chat. And feel free to keep them around for you or someone you know may be struggling. And it's always easier to reach out when we know where to go. Now I'd like to turn to our panelists and introduce them. And so at this moment, I would like to bring up Andrew Mall, Manager Emergency and Disaster Management, Hamilton Health Sciences; Trevor Jane, Medical Doctor, Clinical Health Services Member, Canadian Armed Forces; Michelle Villeneuve, Associate Professor, University of Sydney, Deputy Director, Centre for Disability Research and Policy; and Graham Dodd, Medical Doctor, Associate Medical Director, Health Emergency Management, BC, Physician Lead, Emergency Preparedness, Thompson Region Division of Family Practice. So at this time, we'd like to turn it over to Andrew for some opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Colleen. Good afternoon, everyone. As Colleen mentioned, my name is Andrew Mole, and I am from Hamilton, Ontario, where I'm the manager for emergency and disaster management for Hamilton Health Sciences. I've been doing hospital emergency management coming up on a decade now. Getting started in 2014 during the West African Ebola crisis was the hot topic then. And was previously at Scarborough Health Network until 2019, and then came over here to Hamilton Health Sciences. I also am a co-course director, for the York University Disaster and Emergency Management Program, teaching the healthcare preparedness course with a colleague of mine from Toronto. And I also am, I guess, somewhat of a co-facilitator for the Association of Healthcare Emergency Preparedness Professionals Canadian chapter, and really helping expand standardization and support for hospital emergency management.
Thanks so much, Andrew, and I'm certainly so happy to have you here with us today. I will now turn it over to Trevor.
Hi, everybody. Great to see everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm a disaster and emergency medicine physician in Charlottetown and a proud board member of the Center of Excellence for Emergency Preparedness. Extensive military background and multiple leadership positions, both in humanitarian situations and combat operations. And unfortunately held a leadership position for one of our largest airline disasters in Canada, the Swiss Air disaster on the East Coast. I have a keen interest in disaster management and medicine, and I'm currently the disaster medicine consultant for the province of Prince Edward Island, and looking forward to today's session with my fellow colleagues.
Thank you, Trevor. Michelle.
Hello, everyone, and good morning. My name is Michelle Villeneuve, and I'm the Deputy Director at the Centre for Disability Research and Policy. It's an impact centre at the University of Sydney, and my research centres on disability-inclusive disaster risk reduction. I also have the pleasure of being a committee member on the Emergency Subcommittee for the World Rehabilitation Alliance to inform inclusive disaster risk reduction practices.
Thank you, Michelle. And Graham.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Graham Dodd. As Colleen mentioned, I'm calling to you here from the interior British Columbia on the unceded territory of the Secwepemc people. I've been a frontline physician for over 30 years, 2/3 of that as an emergency physician, but also as a family physician, both in rural and urban settings. I got interested and got exposed to this topic in 1998 in a wildfire in which I was asked to lead a hospital evacuation. And at that time, that's something that really hadn't been heard of. Called friends. They said, great, let us know how you do, because we've never heard of it either. And it just highlighted that as physicians, we had really very little knowledge or experience in emergency management. That experience led me to do a master's degree at Royal Roads University in Victoria in disaster and emergency management. And I've been involved in all aspects of emergency management since then, from the pandemic to, of course, the wildfires, both at local, regional, and provincial levels. I think one of the areas that I've become particularly interested now is in the role of primary care providers and family doctors in emergency management. What resource can they be, and what resource can they serve? All disasters are start locally. They involve local providers first, and so many of those local providers are your family physicians. So what role can they play? So I'm really looking forward to this interesting discussion with a group of very distinguished panelists. So I'm happy to be part of. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. And I think as we start up the discussion for today, and knowing that what each of you bring for this conversation, I think let's maybe start off with a bit of a round table, and would like to hear from each of you about what are some of the core elements from your perspective as it relates to emergency and disaster medicine that are specifically relevant to natural disasters. Graham, you mentioned a few elements within your introductory remarks, so maybe we'll start with you and then go around to the rest of the group.
Yeah, sure. I think it's really important when we think about disasters, and I'm asked to talk about disasters. Most people see them as on television, these large catastrophic things that occur in places that are not where we live. And unfortunately, more and more, these are becoming, part of our environment. Really what defines a disaster in my mind, it's when the local resources become overwhelmed. And so it makes that both topical and relevant. And you can sort of see how that might play in your local community, be it small or large. So it makes them more personal in that aspect. Three things I tell people about disasters is, they all start locally first. So therefore they involve, the local community. They almost all involve some aspect of healthcare. And so they involve local healthcare providers first. And unfortunately, these disasters are now very predictable, but they're also unpredictable at the same time. We know they're coming. We just don't know what they might be, or where they might occur, or when they might occur. We just know that they're coming. So I think one of the big pieces we have to think about moving forward is we have to get out of this envelope of just being reactive, just responding. That's what we see on television. That's often as healthcare providers, when we're brought into, when something has occurred and we have to react to that. But I think as we see this occur these occur more and more frequently, we no longer can afford just to be reactive. We have to be more proactive in our approach. So we have to become involved in preparedness. We have to become more involved in recovery, which is actually the first step of preparedness for the next disaster. So that's the one piece I would bring to our discussion today, is that shift in where we and how we need to look at these disasters.
Thanks so much, Graham. Michelle.
Thanks, Colleen. You know, I'm coming at this topic definitely from the perspective of Australia and our cascading impact of disasters that we've had over the recent years. My research really focuses on what can we do to share responsibility. So lifting off of what Graham was just talking about disasters happening locally, and we have a role and responsibility to pre-plan and prepare. The challenge we found in our research when we started this work about a decade ago was that there were no tools and resources for people with disability and chronic health conditions to take the extra steps that they need to tailor emergency preparedness to their support needs and their risk situation. So they've been really left behind in disaster planning. And we've seen the impact of that worldwide, with people with disability being 2 to 4 times more likely to die in a disaster than the general population, having greater impact in terms of injury, taking longer to recover, requiring more supports and services. But you know, people with disability have been left behind, but so have the services that support people with disability. So when we think about community, healthcare, disability service providers, our emergency services system and sector and policies weren't really keeping those professions and those disciplines front of mind in preparedness planning. So what has happened is it's fallen to emergency services. Sure, in Australia in particular, our emergency services, when the rubber hits the road, it's our emergency services who do need to respond and react. They need to pre-plan and prepare. But they need to do that in partnership with communities, because as Graham mentioned earlier, it's when disasters overwhelm the capacity of communities to undertake their normal care and response in communities that we all have to step in and take our part. So the work that we're doing is really about bringing those sectors together, making sure that emergency personnel have the tools, skills, and capabilities to work in partnership with people with disability and their representative organizations, and alongside the services that support people with disability. So that includes healthcare professionals, that includes community and disability services providers who have routine care and support, routine interactions, and most importantly, the trust of people with disability and other people that they care for with chronic health conditions. Those relationships are a critical feature of the social infrastructure that's required to ensure pre-planning, ensure more effective response, and ensure that services are delivered effectively in that long term of recovery.
Thanks so much, Michelle, and certainly interested as we continue on our conversation today as we look into that equitable access that you highlighted there. Trevor, I'll turn it to you for some remarks on that question.
So when talking about natural disasters, what the literature shows is that the public believes that man-made disasters actually cause more of an impact with event hazards and damage than natural disasters, and it's actually the reverse. We do know that natural disasters do have a significant impact on the population, both within the potential hazards, the event itself, and the damages caused. Just being respectful of my colleagues' times, what I would say is that I think we're going to talk about the philosophy of disasters being local and what that means. I have some thoughts on that, and we'll maybe leave that for a later discussion. But you have to have a plan, and you have to utilize subject matter experts within your community. And you have them right in your community. It doesn't matter if your community is 25 or 50. There's firefighters, there's paramedics, there's volunteers. There might be retired nurses, people who work the hospital. You have all these expertise, veterinarians, like all these expertise that you'll be surprised that are right in your community that can be leveraged to help you manage natural disasters. So I always recommend a little bit of training. I would caution folks that doing ICS training makes you an expert in disaster management. I think it's one tool that's very good in how to communicate. And the third thing I would say is that crisis emergency risk communication, CERC, having some training on crisis emergency risk communication is key at the local level to mobilize your population.
Absolutely, and certainly thinking of that local piece, which we'll look at as well, thinking the various levels involved, but certainly as you've highlighted and others as well, that local aspect. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you. And kind of building off of what my colleagues here have already mentioned is really almost three things actually. There's really a conflagration of three major forces right now in play, and in particular in Canadian healthcare, but this is actually a fairly worldwide phenomenon, is we have an increased occurrence of hazards. So we are seeing more forest fires, worse storms, more flooding, droughts, all of this is happening. We also have the worst kept secret in demographics in the baby boom generation getting older. And so that vulnerable population has been steadily increasing and is going to continue to increase. Working in a hospital, our whole population we consider vulnerable, but that pressure grows and grows. And then on that is we now have a very vulnerable healthcare system. It was vulnerable prior to COVID-19. And then that just got ratcheted up to 11. And now we have staffing shortages, ED closures, especially in small underserved communities. And then as Graham was mentioning, that plays down to the local GPs and the pressures on them. So it's this real conflagration that puts us in a tight spot in terms of preparedness. And really what's been missing, and I think we're kind of heading towards a turning point, is previously there's been a lot of siloed work across a number of fields, and even within healthcare. It's really only in the last decade or so that even different hospitals, emergency management professionals are starting to talk together and plan together. So I think we're going to need to move out of those silos, start engaging your local community emergency managers and your first responders, your local GPs, your local community groups, Canadian Red Cross, all these expertise that Trevor was talking about, to try and kind of take on this three-headed dragon we're facing.
Absolutely. And maybe we'll start to unpack that a bit more, Andrew. And as you've mentioned, is how are we learning from our past, but also knowing the reality of the situations that are. So how do we help prepare for that? I know in some of our earlier conversations, you mentioned that you came into emergency management from a historian path. So I'm wondering if you can speak to continue from what you were just mentioning there, how the field of emergency and disaster medicine changed to those increasing demands, as you've mentioned, of the natural disasters in the recent years, and where do we still need to go?
Certainly, I was kind of looking when we got a heads up on this question. I was thinking, what is the history here? And unfortunately, and even as Graham mentioned, in '98 with a hospital evacuating in Canada, that was relatively unheard of. And I mean, emergency management in Canada is really 1990 is when the Emergency Management Act came in play. So if you kind of go from then, you've got the Ontario, Quebec ice storm, our friends in Manitoba with the Red River flooding, the forest fires out west and out east. But you're not seeing similar to what our American friends especially have seen with their major hurricanes and wildfire seasons. So I think in Canada, 2003 was really I don't want to say our 9/11. 9/11 certainly played a big impact on hospital emergency management, healthcare emergency management. But 2003 was SARS, coupled with the BC wildfire season that year, coupled with the Eastern blackout, all kind of put an initiative to get more serious about this. It's taken a long time. COVID, I think, has certainly really escalated how many folks are taking this more seriously. Unfortunately, too many institutions are still running, if they have someone dedicated to this specific field, one per organization. And so I think that's starting to change. And but historically, we're really only looking at the last 20, 30 years. And I think the best example I've seen from a healthcare institution learning from, say, a natural hazard is in Texas. In particular, Houston is in early 2000s, Hurricane Allison came in, did a lot of damage. Hospital generators got flooded, lost backup power, had to evacuate. And so what they've done in some of the hospitals there is installed submarine doors, and done hard infrastructure upgrades, installed berms around the perimeter of the hospital. So in 2017, when Hurricane Harvey came in, some of these hospitals that previously went through this experience learned from them, installed proper mitigation methods, and learned from in their recovery process. And then they didn't have to evacuate. They were actually a safe haven during Hurricane Harvey, and they were able to still provide that continuity of care to their community.
Oh, really interesting. And I think it's also about those lessons that we learn, but also implementing those actions and those safeguards or whatever those actions are, so that when it does come, not just taking the lessons learned and nothing happening, so that can go from there. I know, Michelle, you've mentioned, and it's wonderful to have you back in Canada, but knowing that as you've been in Australia, and knowing that there's been also a lot of natural disasters that have been happening there, wondering if you can also speak to that perspective of the lessons learned from those events and the emergency preparedness and response.
Yeah, sure. And in some ways, we were on the front foot when it comes to including people with disability and their supporting services in the pre-planning process. It was actually in 2015 that we started working on this topic, bringing the three sectors together that I mentioned earlier: people with disability, their support services, and government and emergency services who are responsible for emergency management planning. We started bringing them together, and the challenge in 2015 in Australia is that these groups had never worked together. There was a lot of assumptions about what emergency services were going to do for service providers as well as individuals in the community. And, our emergency services colleagues, I probably, if I had $1 for every time they said it, I'd be quite rich, that the communities are complacent and services are complacent in their organizational and preparedness planning. And that was kind of the situation in 2015. When we started bringing these groups together, it was amazing how much they learned and shared by working together and trying to address the problems very directly through conversation. The power of conversation to show what skills, knowledge, and talents that each of the sectors have to bring together. And also increasing the trust that government and emergency sector can have in the rest of us to do our jobs really well and play our part really well. You can imagine when the rubber hits the road for emergency services, they want everyone to be safe, and they hold that responsibility very close and very dear. So it's really hard to also give up that trust and share that responsibility with other people when we've had a history of being unprepared and unplanned for. When we started to bring these sectors together, we recognized that one of the biggest gaps in us taking our responsibilities was that there were really no tools for us to do that effectively. So we started to build them together. So by 2019, sort of at the height of our Black Summer bushfires in Australia, we had the person-centered emergency preparedness resources and toolkit. We had been co-designing and field testing that with multiple stakeholders across the community. Our health sector had contributed to the specific management of health elements and the personal support and technology elements of that toolkit. And people with disability were literally taking that for a road test and developing their own preparedness plans. But I can tell you, on New Year's, as we were turning into 2020, it was probably the most stressful time for me, because I knew that we still did not have enough information, not enough evidence, and not enough people with disabilities planned and prepared. And it was quite anxiety producing to see what was happening on the very south coast of Victoria with the evacuations in Malakuta, for example, and the people who were being left behind on the beaches because they had no physical way to access helicopters for evacuation and boats and so on. It was in that moment that we showed the evidence of the work and the collaboration that we've been building all along. It was literally in that moment that our disability advocacy organizations stepped up with incredible force. I could then step back, and our advocates stepped into that role of finding homes, finding evacuation routes, finding alternatives and contingencies, and keeping the communication alive and well for people who were deaf, who communicated differently, who needed to access information or resources in different ways. And I can say for sure that we're certainly a long way to go in terms of full preparedness of the entire country and full access for all people with disability and chronic health conditions to the plans they need and the responses that the government emergency services need to take. But we've got incredible momentum because we've built that capacity from the grassroots up.
No, absolutely. And I think maybe what we'll do is start looking and chatting a bit about that that system, and also that local perspective, and knowing to help see that change. So, but Graham, just wondering if can share from your perspective and coming from that system provincial perspective, what are some of the main challenges you're noticing when it comes to the regions preparing, and what are some of the strategies to overcome this? And then, Trevor, I'm going to look to you about us leaning into a bit about that local element, and to really help us elaborate that further.
Yeah, thanks, Colleen. You're right. From a systems perspective, where do we look at? And I think you have to go back to we'll specifically talk about health, and I can talk from a physician perspective with regard to the system. Most physicians in Canada have had very little training, teaching, of any kind of emergency management, either in their medical school years or in their residency years. And so even to bring up this topic of emergency management, many of my colleagues will sort of look and go, we don't know much about where we would fit in. And I think that addresses part of the challenge that, as Andrew mentioned, this breaking down of silos. We all need to speak a common language. As Michelle talked about, the vulnerable population, one of the things that came to mind is I couldn't help but think that many of these vulnerable folks are under the care of family physicians, nurse practitioners, who know their patients well. If people are fortunate enough to have a family doc or a nurse practitioner, but we haven't included this group into our traditional emergency preparedness, health emergency preparedness. We've focused on hospitals. The Australasia area is so much of the pioneering work of emergency, health emergency management has come from down under. And, I spent a lot of time talking with my colleagues in New Zealand following the earthquake in Christchurch, and the role in which those community family docs played. And they had already sort of formed an organization of first responding family physicians, and so they took it on to their role was to save the hospital, because in a disaster everyone turns to the hospital, and as we know, our hospitals are already overwhelmed. Colleagues of mine will say we can't even begin to talk about this in our hospitals because we're so overloaded and overcrowded and burnt out. We'll deal with that once we fix the current problem. But I don't think we have time to wait, because as we've all mentioned, these disasters are occurring with increasing frequency. So one of the ways I think moving forward is to look at how, as a collective body, all healthcare can be involved in this. And as I mentioned earlier, I think one of the things is to move away from just the reactive approach. It's traditionally worked, and I think most healthcare providers and healthcare systems will step up if called upon. We see that as our role and our duty, but that's incredibly taxing on the system. It's incredibly taxing on responders. We see increasing amounts of responder burnout, etc. And so I think one of the ways to get past that is to really think about this ahead of time, to put in those mitigation strategies, to put in those preparedness strategies, so that when we respond, we know that we're part of a collective system which will help us be supportive. I heard the term complacency, and I think that's an increasing problem as well. I mean, we see that following the wildfires. As soon as that wildfire season ends, everyone's like, oh my gosh, finally we're done, right? And if I bring up the topic of, well, let's talk about next year, it's like, no, next year is next year. We'll deal with that next year. But the time to the time for a systematic change is actually in that recovery period. That's part of the whole role of recovery, is to use that time to learn those lessons, to prepare for the next step and the next, and for that next sort of season that occurs. So adding family physicians, building a better connection between our health emergency management colleagues and our physician, that is disaster medicine. It's that intersection between emergency preparedness, emergency management, between public health, between acute care medicine. And acute care medicine, now I'm saying, is not just hospital-based, it's also community-based. So I think those are some of the ways in which we need to look at moving forward. Every crisis is an opportunity, right? And as Winston Churchill once said, you never let a good crisis go to waste. So we can't lose these opportunities. As much as we'd love to say, and certainly coming from the interior of British Columbia, where we burn every year, it would be nice to, but I know we still haven't burnt all the trees. We're still destined for more concerns in the next few years.
Thanks, Graham. And Trevor, I'll turn to you and interested to hear your thoughts from two perspectives, certain that local element piece and looking at that, but also from a leadership perspective. And then I'm gonna look to our the other panelist and really invite each of you to, if there's a key thing you want to lean into based off of what each other has said. So, but over to you, Trevor.
Yeah, so I mean, PEI, Prince Edward Island, where I live, we were the first time in history that an entire province lost their power grid for a substantial amount of time, and that was last year in Fiona. And so we had one of the worst hurricanes, and living through that, we learned some things. I am a huge proponent that all disasters are local, and every community, every municipality should have a community emergency response team. And what that is, if you bear with me, Niagara region has done a great job of this in Ontario. They've done a fantastic job. I've used that as an example when I teach disaster medicine. And because, you know, we mentioned about the hospital, but it's the pre-hospital environment where disasters hit and have an impact downstream. And these community emergency response teams, they're phenomenal. They're able, you know, they're volunteers in your community that meet a certain criteria. They have a police check. They're mobile. They have a driver's license. They have a vehicle. And they get about 8 weeks of training, one night a week, just for a couple hours at your local town hall, your local community center, or your local place of worship. And experts from their own community come in. So you may have a firefighter come in and show you how to use a fire extinguisher or generator safety. You'll have your local arborist from the gardening center come in and say, this is a chainsaw. These are the things that you have to watch when you use a chainsaw. How public health comes in. How do you do a door knock on the elderly properly? A nurse would come in and say, here's some basic first aid. So within 8 weeks, you have a depth of resiliency in your community, a community response team that your local leader, a councillor, a mayor, or local leader in a very small community can activate to help the community right then and there. There's lots of literature to show that all disasters are local. My experience being involved in a number of hot, difficult environments is that it is the local population that responds first. And by the time you get specialized teams, you know, the Army, the Red Cross, you know, St. John, whatever, heavy urban search and rescue, Casera, all those folks, it takes about 48 to 72 hours. So I'm a big proponent. I'm a cheerleader for community emergency response teams. I want all municipalities in Canada, if we could do that. We started doing that on the island. If you know anybody on here, if you want to see how it's done, go. You know, I don't live in Niagara Falls. I get no bounce back or percentage of the tourism there, but they got a great Niagara region CERT team, and I think that's a great model. And so stop there with that. With regards to leadership, I've been being thrust in a couple difficult leadership positions, one in Northern Iraq and, the Swiss air disaster, COVID, and then here on the island in Fiona. What I would say is this: there's two things that are going to work against you if you're put in a leadership position in a disaster. And they both have to do with humans. One is egos and one is stress. So those I teach on one of my courses. I'm seeing some head nodding there that in a disaster, sometimes you have to separate rank from role. And what I mean by that is a person in a leadership position during normal operations, when something hits the fan, they actually might not be the best person to lead at that particular point. So sometimes you have to separate rank from role. You have to deal with difficult egos. and you have to watch people's acute stress reactions. And we saw that in COVID in 2020. I'm sure that every facility saw people doing odd things, and that was just a normal reaction in an abnormal time. So CERT teams, community emergency response teams, and ego and stress reactions.
Sounds so simple, yet in practice, not necessarily, right? So, but certainly important as to deal through these type of situations. Any comments or reflections we've really impact from thinking of from that system perspective, that local, that leadership? Really want to hear a bit more and understand and think of that equity access piece, Michelle, but certainly looking to Andrew, Michelle, Graham, Trevor, if there's something that's a bit put a flag as each of your fellow panelists have spoken this morning.
One of the things I would love to add to the conversation is, we talk about the grassroots, and I wholeheartily agree that locally and grassroots solutions are the way to actually make sure that everyone is safe in communities. But it can be very easy for people to not know how to take that responsibility. I loved Trevor's examples and very practical examples of how local community CERT teams could actually action those things. One of the things that we've learned in Australia is the importance of also having policies in place that provide nationally consistent approaches. I think Graham also spoke to the need, and maybe Andrew as well, the need for training. And so one of the things we learned along the way was, we built these person-centered emergency preparedness tools, and I'll put in the chat how people can access those tools because they're openly available and people can start using them today if they like. But when we started using them, producing them, we thought, okay, here we go. We've produced the tools. Now go use them. But actually, it takes a lot more than just the tool. You need to build the confidence and the capability in people who actually don't know about, your average healthcare provider isn't going to know about disaster and emergency management and exactly how to enact their roles in that space. So we need to build nationally consistent training and programs. We've just been doing that with our person-centered emergency program. And we have the first interdisciplinary training ground for emergency government stakeholders, people with disability, and the services that support them to come and learn together in a self-paced online learning environments. And we've shown how we can move the needle from totally underprepared to activated, aware, and ready to take charge from different stakeholder roles in emergency situations.
Interesting. Andrew, wondering from some of the training and program support, if can maybe jump onto a bit of what Michelle's mentioned there. And I know we even have a question in the chat about really taking in that equity, those equity considerations in the discourse of this as well.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, as I think from a training perspective, there's really only a handful of schools and institutions right now within Canada that even offer emergency management as a course. I know a lot of colleges do have some really strong programs as well, but at a national level, I think the National Emergency Preparedness or Management College closed back in 2012, I want to say, and it hasn't been reopened. And I'm not sure what the discussion is on that. And a lot of things have been mostly in Canada, because it's health as a provincial jurisdiction. It's been somewhat cloistered within provinces, and we haven't had that national leadership to identify what are those common standards. And even only recently, and I can only speak from a hospital standpoint, but only recently as Accreditation Canada updated their emergency management standards, going from only 13 lines of fairly basic standards of, do you have a plan? Do you look at the plan? Do you maybe bring it out and test it sometimes? To a bit more robust, still needs a bit more work, but we don't have that national framework set up. And I don't know if that's something Public Health Canada can take lead on, or if it's for our emergency preparedness minister or public safety. But I think it's something that's missing. And then we need that. I think what Michelle and Trevor mentioned is that grassroots is great, but we kind of need that from the ground up, but you also need that top down leadership and support as well.
Trevor, looks like you're jumping. Yeah.
Yeah, so thanks for that question, Diane. I want to clarify, like what Niagara region does might be different than what Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island does compared to what Graham's going to do in BC based on your local community and culture. So I'll give you an example. For us, flooding would be a concern. So maybe in that, and I just used 8 weeks because that's what Niagara has. It could be a 6 weeks, it could be 12 weeks. Your local mayor, councillor, community leader might say, you know what, one of those nights we're going to learn how to fill up sandbags and lift them. Simple things. Are you able-bodied able to do that? Can you lift 25 pounds? So when I mentioned that course, that was very specific to Niagara region, and that's the beauty of community emergency response teams. To go what Michelle said with vulnerable populations and those disabled, your community knows your street. So even if you don't know every neighbor, if I'm on a CERT team and I've been asked to do a door knock on my subdivision, I know that maybe Mrs. Smith has a wheelchair, and we got to consider that when we're doing a door knock and making sure they have electricity and food. Can they get out to get groceries? That type of thing. So I know I'm speaking at the very tactical level, at the very bedside level, the very street level, the pre-hospital level. And the reason being that we've all experienced big binders of policy and procedures and SOPs. And then when something happens, nobody's read 400 pages. But if you keep things simple, and you can activate in my case, still being a cheerleader for CERT, these teams, you can start there and mesh it with your policies and procedures. One thing that Andrew mentioned that I want to support is that have you brought it out and tried your SOPs? So I have a saying that standard operating procedures do not exist unless they've been rehearsed. So I can write a binder and give it to everybody on this call and say, those are our SOPs. They don't exist unless we actually rehearse them. So with regards to the course, talk to your community, be careful because they might say, that sounds like a great idea. You should do it, right? And then design your own kind of CERT team for your own climate and culture.
Thanks for that, Trevor, and certainly that importance of that community engagement and community driven. And as Andrew you were also mentioning there of really that community, but also within the healthcare team as well. Graham, just thinking of that healthcare team, and also as mentioned, there's been a lot of pressures on the realities for the health workforce now, and just kind of thinking that there's also the impacts on the workforce as it relates to some of those to the natural disasters. What are some ways that we can support them, both in that preparation, but also during and post?
And there's several ways I think we can start to look at this. I think from a training perspective, just getting of emergency and disaster management into medical and nursing school, so you at least become familiar with the language and the topic, so that there's a bit of awareness of that. Same in medical school and residencies. You will find that there are local community champions in the medical world and the health world for this topic. And we need to find them. But not only that, we need to actually support them. This is hard work to do on the side of your desk, right? And so we actually need to support, and part of that is financial support for these persons to take on this role, to be that conduit between our emergency management colleagues and our frontline clinician colleagues as well, to be able to play that role. So I think that's one of the ways we can do that. I think we can look at, as Michelle brought up the word tools. Yeah, there are tools we can help create to help, clinics in communities become better prepared to think about, the things that they need to do and role they can play. But again, tools are only as good as they're looked at, as was mentioned. So I think there's a few things we can do that's fairly low-hanging fruit that we can start to, bring this topic to light more. I'll stop there. I had another thought, but it escaped, but I'm sure it'll pop.
Anyone else on the panel that might wanna and thinking of the workforce, Michelle?
Well, I'd love to just jump in on that topic of tools, because our emergency services sector has no end of tools to prepare us, to make us aware of our disaster risk and to prepare us for emergencies. Every nation worldwide has their way of doing this, and it stems really, if you think about our international frameworks, which the current one is the Sendai framework for disaster risk reductions. There are two main imperatives for our emergency sector. That is to make sure we know our risks and make sure we're pre-planned and prepared in how to respond to those risks. But really, when we think about equitable access, we're not doing a very good job of making that information accessible to everybody in our community. So when we build tools, we need to make sure they're tools that everybody can use. And so the point of the work that we've been doing is actually to build them together, to have a shared language, to break down the barriers that get in the way of interprofessional working in this space, and to make it quite simple and straightforward for communities to understand. When we started doing the work, and people would say, you can't take a person-centered approach to emergency preparedness because we prepare populations and whole communities. And we've actually seen a transformational shift in Australia in our emergency sector because of the value that's now placed on, wow, when each individual takes their share of the responsibility, we get whole of community action.
And one other quick thing that made me think too, what can we do? I think we responders also need to be personally prepared, because we can both be in a community, both a responder and a victim at the same time. And it's very difficult to be a responder if you don't know if your family's safe. You're called off to work, you're called off, but it's very hard to focus if you don't know if your family's safe. So having a family emergency plan, a family communication plan, is sort of the first step of being personally prepared, which will then help you professionally respond. And by better preparedness activity, you're actually reducing the stress or chance of future stress when we respond.
Trevor.
I always talk about normalizing. So we saw this during an airline crash where we had to process 15,000 DNA parts basically. And one of the things that we did for our workforce to really look after them, that I was adamant about, is normalize the unnormal. So we had a normal work day, a normal battle rhythm. We had lockers, facilities, showers, normal meal times while they're doing that sacred work in between for the families. And we talk about disasters acute and a steady state, right? There's this natural steady state of flow of response that happens after the acute state, and that's one way that you can look after your workforce that in a pre-hospital environment that are responding, well fed, dressed, looked after, and supported. The other thing is be careful of bureaucratic dragging that sneaks in on day 7 or day 6. So other organizations that don't want anything to do with it initially, hands off, but they'll start to creep in, and I don't mean in a bad way. They got a job to do, occupational health and safety, a whole bunch of things to look after, and sometimes that causes friction and frustration. So I think going back to those SOPs, if they're rehearsed with all players, then people know each other. But normalizing your day in a horrific, as much as possible, in a horrific circumstance, does a lot for mental health for your workforce, pre, post, and pre, during, and after.
And one thing to add and build upon what my fellow panelists have mentioned is with any of these tools, and certainly we found this within hospitals and healthcare, where physicians, nurses, everyone has very busy days, and emergency management, we're the jerk who pulls the fire alarm and disrupts their normal cadence. But one thing we certainly do, and kind of feeding off what Trevor mentioned, is that routine of reminding folks of any type of emergency can happen. You do monthly drills, but it's not just doing that. It's when you're building those SOPs, one, making them as simple as possible. KISS principle is golden. checklist, but it's the key to it is answering the question how. It's not so much to say, yes, we want to set up X treatment site. You have to also include how you're going to do it. And I think this expands beyond just hospitals into any realm. And this is a huge gap we ran into with pandemic planning, was we had all these high level targets, but none of the decade-long prep work really delved into, okay, how are we going to do this? And testing it and working it out. And so I think whether in hospitals, communities, any CERT teams, any group, is really, if you're whatever plans you're design them, not just your organization, but whoever's playing in that sandbox needs to participate in building those plans. You want to answer how, and you want to keep it as simple as possible.
Thanks, Andrew. And Michelle, really interested to your perspective on the how and the building and the learning, especially from that equity lens.
Yeah, I think this is kind of an important segue because of that critical fact. Our research has shown that even our emergency services and government planners with responsibilities in this space do not have preparedness plans themselves. It's humbling to go through our course and to have that self-assessment process and realize that we are preparing communities but are underprepared ourselves. But when we think about the people on the line today, I would love to encourage people on the line to be absolutely empowered. Does your health service, organization, community, wherever you're working, is there an organizational and service continuity plan in place? Normally, we leave that to upper management to create those. And as Trevor said earlier, they sit in a binder somewhere in a management office. And it's actually the frontline people who need to understand how those plans are meant to be operationalized. And it's those people that first need to know they exist, and second, need to contribute to their improvement, and third, need to practice them regularly with each other and with the people that they support. So have those conversations. If you're an individual with a disability or a health condition yourself, reach out and ask those questions of your service provider. And if you're a service provider, don't be afraid to not yet know the answers. Just say, that's a great question. I'm going to go explore that with my manager or my line manager and find out, because it's all about having and starting these conversations. The more we avoid the conversation, the more we increase risks. And the more we open it up to dialogue, the more that we will be able to work together.
Thanks so much, Michelle. And certainly that collective, right, to really from that local perspective and preparing and learning and going forward. It's gone by quite quickly. And so would like to offer each of you a few minutes for some final remarks. And I'll go to Graham first.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I've learned as much today as I hope you have as well. I'll leave you with one piece. I usually give there's a quote that I love that came from an article published 2009 regarding disasters, and it really brought it home for me in that it said that appropriately educated and prepared health professionals are the most essential component when it comes to reducing mortality and morbidity following a disaster. So those healthcare professionals are from the front line, basic paramedics, all the way to the, retired physicians and nurses who often get called back. So if they're prepared and educated, they're tremendously important in reducing mortality and morbidity. And I put in a plea for everyone to not forget their community family doctors. My colleague in Australia, Dr. Penny Burns, brought out, is often said to me that, these increasing challenges require a really resilient healthcare system, and a family physician has an important role to play. So we need to incorporate not just hospital-based healthcare into managing disasters, but also look at community providers, community pharmacists, right? Community family docs, nurse practitioners, etc. So there's a lot we can learn, but every opportunity every challenge is another opportunity.
Thanks, Graham. Andrew.
Thank you. I think if there's one this has been a fantastic panel. I've really enjoyed it. And I think one thing for folks to take away is, I haven't heard this said yet, and it's usually said at least once every emergency management related presentation, is you don't exchange business cards in the command center or during a response. So really, I want to encourage everyone on the line to go out and make those connections, not only within your own community and through the different services, but within your professional group and beyond. And just realize that it does take a whole community to respond well to a disaster, and even more so to recover well from a disaster. And so really building those bridges is absolutely essential to being successful. And for us, and the topic of natural hazards and climate changes, being prepared for what's coming down the pipeline.
Thanks, Andrew. Michelle, and then over to you, Trevor.
I'd really like to encourage a conversation that speaks to capability instead of vulnerability. If we can stop thinking of people as vulnerable and think about what situations and circumstances they're vulnerable to before, during, and after disasters, then we can eliminate the structural barriers and the challenges and pre-plan for the supports people need. We can't respond and plan effectively for the support needs of people with disability and chronic conditions if we don't know what they can do for themselves and what they need support for. And then that starts to create a really important dialogue between individuals and the services that support them, because each has capabilities to contribute in emergency management.
Yeah, so what I would say and end up with is, if you could do one thing for your community or as a leader on this call, is community emergency response teams. I can't harp on them enough. I've seen communities overseas in horrific circumstances that have not had any sort of organic response ability themselves, and I've seen communities that have had training and have organized themselves, and their level of response with regards to safety, resiliency, and recovery, it is amazing. And we can do that in Canada. We have fantastic bunch of talented Canadians in all sorts of communities, and all across the coast to coast. And it doesn't cost much. And if we could get some community emergency response teams and that enthusiasm going, I think we'd be well served for what's to come.
Yeah, and the thing I just mentioned from Trevor, that a resilient community following a disaster is one that doesn't just build back; it's one that builds back better.
Well, certainly that talent has been on display today. Thank you very much for this excellent and insightful discussion. We hope that all those online found this session informative. You will receive a follow-up email with the link to this recording that you can share with your colleagues. As well, you'll receive a blog summary and so you're also welcome to subscribe to our newsletter to hear more about ways that you can get involved with Healthcare Excellence Canada. And as you see, there's a poll, and that feedback is so valuable to us. So if you're able to take a few moments to provide us with some feedback on today's session, and the 2 poll questions will appear up on your screen. And we'd also love to hear from you in the chat or by follow-up email. Once again, I'd like to thank Andrew, Trevor, Michelle, and Graham for the excellent reflections, sharings, and learnings today. And of course, thank you to our audience for joining us today. This concludes today's event. Have a great day, everyone.